Teachings and instructions from the Supreme Personality of Godhead, Krishna/Govinda. What follows are topical excerpts from the original Bhagavata Siddhanta Vedic Shastra of Govinda, the Supreme Primal Being, regarding the subject of that which covers the eternal knowledge and life of all living creatures. Translations from the original Sanskrit Bhagavata Siddhanta Vedic Shastra of Govinda, the Supreme Primal Being, with added Parampara commentations by His Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada and devoted disciples/followers with digital editing/coding for the purpose of pronunciation using the Learn Out and Speak True Voice American English Text-to-Speech engine and for the open propagation of these teachings. Bhagavad Gita as it is, Chapter 3, Text 37. Shri Bhagavanu Vacha, Kama Esha Krodha Esha, Rajoguna Samudbhavaha, Mahashano Mahapapma, Vidyanam, Iha, Virenam. Translation. The Supreme Personality of Godhead said, "It is lust only, Arjuna, which is born of contact with the material mode of passion and later, transformed into wrath, and which is the all-devouring sinful enemy of this world." Purport. When a living entity comes in contact with a material creation, his eternal love for Krishna is transformed into lust in association with a mode of passion. Or, in other words, the sense of love of God becomes transformed into lust, as milk in contact with sour tamarind is transformed into yogurt. Then again, when lust is unsatisfied, it turns into wrath. Wrath is transformed into illusion, and illusion continues the material existence. Therefore, lust is the greatest enemy of a living entity, and it is lust only which induces the pure, living entity to remain entangled in the material world. Wrath is the manifestation of the mode of ignorance. These modes exhibit themselves as wrath and other corollaries. If, therefore, the mode of passion, instead of being degraded into the mode of ignorance, is elevated to the mode of goodness by the prescribed method of living and acting, then one can be saved from the degradation of wrath by spiritual attachment. The Supreme Personality of Godhead expanded himself into many for his ever-increasing spiritual bliss, and the living entities are parts and parcels of this spiritual bliss. They also have partial independence, but by misuse of their independence, when the service attitude is transformed into the propensity for sense enjoyment, they come under the sway of lust. This material creation is created by the Lord to give facility to the conditioned souls to fulfill these lustful propensities, and when completely baffled by prolonged lustful activities, the living entities begin to inquire about their real position. This inquiry is the beginning of the Vedanta Sutras, wherein it is said, Asato Brahma Jignasa. One should inquire into the Supreme, and the Supreme is defined in Srimad Bhagavatam as Janmadhyasyatonvyadiparadishcha. Or, the origin of everything is the Supreme Brahman. Therefore the origin of lust is also in the Supreme. If, therefore, lust is transformed into love for the Supreme, or transformed into Krishna consciousness, or, in other words, desiring everything for Krishna, then both lust and wrath can be spiritualized. Hanuman, the great servitor of Lord Rama, exhibited his wrath by burning the golden city of Ravana, but by doing so he became the greatest devotee of the Lord. Here also, in Bhagavad Gita, the Lord induces Arjuna to engage his wrath upon his enemies for the satisfaction of the Lord. Therefore, lust and wrath, when they are employed in Krishna consciousness, become our friends instead of our enemies. Bhagavad Gita as it is, Chapter 3, Text 38. Humanarite vanir, yaha darsho malina cha, yaha vinarito garbhas, tatha tenatamaritam. Translation. As fire is covered by smoke, as a mirror is covered by dust, or as the embryo is covered by the womb, the living entity is similarly covered by different degrees of this lust. Purport. There are 3 degrees of covering of the living entity, by which his pure consciousness is obscured. This covering is but lust under different manifestations like smoke in the fire, dust on the mirror, and the womb about the embryo. When lust is compared to smoke, it is understood that the fire of the living spark can be a little perceived. In other words, when the living entity exhibits his Krishna consciousness slightly, he may be likened to the fire, covered by smoke. Although fire is necessary where there is smoke, there is no overt manifestation of fire in the early stage. This stage is like the beginning of Krishna consciousness. The dust on the mirror refers to a cleansing process of the mirror of the mind by so many spiritual methods. The best process is to chant the holy names of the Lord. The embryo, covered by the womb, is an analogy illustrating a helpless position, for the child in the womb is so helpless that he cannot even move. This stage of living condition can be compared to that of the trees. The trees are also living entities, but they have been put in such a condition of life, by such a great exhibition of lust, that they are almost void of all consciousness. The covered mirror is compared to the birds and beasts, and the smoke-covered fire is compared to the human being. In the form of a human being, the living entity may revive a little Krishna consciousness, and, if he makes further development, the fire of spiritual life can be kindled in the human form of life. By careful handling of the smoke in the fire can be made to blaze. Therefore the human form of life is a chance for the living entity to escape the entanglement of material existence. In the human form of life, one can conquer the enemy, lust, by cultivation of Krishna consciousness under able guidance. Bhagavad Gita as it is, Chapter 3, Text 39. Aritam Jnanametena, Jnanino Nityavirina, Kamarupena Konteya, Dushpurinam. Translation. Thus the wise, living entity's pure consciousness, becomes covered by his eternal enemy in the form of lust, which is never satisfied and which burns like fire. Purport. It is said in the MSPeedy that lust cannot be satisfied by any amount of sense enjoyment, just as fire is never extinguished by a constant supply of fuel. In the material world, the center of all activities is sex, and thus this material world is called Mithunagara, or the Shackles of Sex life. In the ordinary prison house, criminals are kept within bars. Similarly, the criminals who are disobedient to the laws of the Lord are shackled by sex life. Advancement of material civilization on the basis of sense gratification means increasing the duration of the material existence of a living entity. Therefore, this lust is the symbol of ignorance, by which the living entity is kept within the material world. While one enjoys sense gratification, it may be that there is some feeling of happiness, but actually, that so-called feeling of happiness is the ultimate enemy of the sense enjoyer. Bhagavad Gita as it is, Chapter 3, Text 40. Indriyani mano buddhir asyadhisthanamuchite atervimohayityesha jnanamalrityadehinam. Translation. The senses, the mind and the intelligence, are the sitting places of this lust. Through them lust covers the real knowledge of the living entity and bewilders him. Purport. The enemy has captured different strategic positions in the body of the conditioned soul, and therefore Lord Krishna is giving hints of those places so that one who wants to conquer the enemy may know where he can be found. Mind is the center of all the activities of the senses, and thus when we hear about sense objects, the mind generally becomes a reservoir of all ideas of sense gratification, and, as a result, the mind and the senses become the repositories of lust. Next, the intelligence department becomes the capital of such lustful propensities. Intelligence is the immediate next-door neighbor of the spirit soul. Lusty intelligence influences the spirit soul to acquire the false ego and identify itself with matter, and thus with the mind and senses. The spirit soul becomes addicted to enjoying the material senses and mistakes this as true happiness. This false identification of the spirit soul is very nicely explained in the Srimad Bhagavatam 10.84.13. Yasyatma buddhihi kunake tridhatuke, sadihi kalatradishu bhama igjadihi, yat tirtha buddhihi solilingakarhichij, janshvabhigeshu sa eva gokaraha. A human being who identifies this body, made of three elements, with his self, who considers the byproducts of the body to be his kinsmen, who considers the land of birth worshipable, and who goes to the place of pilgrimage simply to take a bath rather than meet men of transcendental knowledge there, is to be considered like an ass or a cow. Bhagavad Gita as it is, Chapter 3, Text 41. Tasmat Vamindriyanyano, Niyamyabharatarshebha, Papmanam Prajahihiyanam, Jnana Vijnana Nashanam. Translation. Therefore, O Arjuna, best of the Bharatas, in the very beginning curb this great symbol of sin, lust, by regulating the senses, and slay this destroyer of knowledge and self-realization. Purport. The Lord advised Arjuna to regulate the senses from the very beginning so that he could curb the greatest sinful enemy, lust, which destroys the urge for self-realization and specific knowledge of the self. Jnana refers to knowledge of self as distinguished from non-self, or in other words, knowledge that the spirit soul is not the body. Vijnana refers to specific knowledge of the spirit soul's constitutional position and his relationship to the Supreme Soul. It is explained thus in the Srimad Bhagavatam 2.9.31. Jnanam paramaguyam me, yad vijnana samanvitam, sarasyam tadam gansha, grihana iditam maya. The knowledge of the Self and Supreme Self is very confidential and mysterious, but such knowledge and specific realization can be understood if explained with their various aspects by the Lord Himself. Bhagavad Gita gives us that general and specific knowledge of the Self. The living entities are parts and parcels of the Lord, and therefore they are simply meant to serve the Lord. This consciousness is called Krishna consciousness. So, from the very beginning of life one has to learn this Krishna consciousness, and thereby one may become fully Krishna conscious and act accordingly. Lust is only the perverted reflection of the love of God, which is natural for every living entity. But if one is educated in Krishna consciousness from the very beginning, that natural love of God cannot deteriorate into lust. When love of God deteriorates into lust, it is very difficult to return to the normal condition. Nonetheless, Krishna consciousness is so powerful that even a late beginner can become a lover of God by following the regulative principles of devotional service. So, from any stage of life, or from the time of understanding its urgency, one can begin regulating the senses in Krishna consciousness, devotional service of the Lord, and turn the lust into love of Godhead, the highest perfectional stage of human life. Thus ends the translations from the original Sanskrit Bhagavata Siddhanta Vedic Shastra of Govinda, the Supreme Primal Being, with added Parampara commentations by His Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada and devoted disciples/followers with digital editing/coding for the purpose of pronunciation using the Learn Out and Hospi True Voice American English Text-to-Speech engine and for the open propagation of these teachings. Hari-ol. All glories. Jai Guru Garanga. Jai Radha Govinda.